Thank you, Madam Speaker, and on behalf of the ACT Greens, I rise to respond to the 22-23 budget. With your indulgence, I'd like to start this budget reply with a brief but exciting tale about a Greens policy. Once, many years ago, before the 2016 election, the ACT Greens proposed a policy to begin the phase-out of fossil fuel gas in the ACT. We said at the time the perils of climate change demand that we start phasing out gas, and we need to begin this phase-out in an equitable way. Now, at that time, our Labor and Liberal colleagues did not support that policy. One of them, who I won't name as they are still in the Assembly, said the idea was ridiculous. Then, prior to the 2020 election, the ACT Greens again put forward our policy to begin the phase-out of fossil fuel gas. We said it's a bold but necessary policy, and we need to go through this journey with the community. Our Labor and Liberal colleagues again did not support that policy. A different colleague, who again I won't name as they are also in the Assembly, dismissed the policy as crazy. The most recent chapter of this dramatic tale is set right here in the Assembly today. In a jaw-dropping twist, the 22-23 budget contains significant funding to support the ACT's phase-out of fossil fuel gas as we commit to replacing this expensive and polluting fuel with clean, renewable electricity. Our members will have seen today's announcement about the electrification pathway the ACT government is pursuing. It's a policy to which this government, made up of both Greens and Labor members, is now committed. Our government partners have joined the project and we're implementing this electrification pathway together. I mention this story because in many ways it is the quintessential story of the Greens and our efforts in the ACT Assembly. We are not afraid to campaign for these progressive, evidence-based, long-term necessary policies with courage and with conviction and persistence. Others will sometimes ignore, ridicule or attempt to stymie these efforts. But then, even if it's years later, we see these policies are adopted. Or sometimes they're adopted and sometimes they're co-opted. More often now, we achieve them through hard work as part of government. But the important thing is that the policies are increasingly implemented. The gas transition is one of several significant environmental and social policies that have, over the years, been ignored or scorned by various politicians, by vested interests, and yes, even sometimes by colleagues here in the Assembly. But we continue to see them realised in government policy and in government budgets, just like this year's budget. That's because the Greens are working hard, both as part of government and as an engaged crossbench, to see these policies realised. And it's because the policies aren't ridiculous or crazy at all. They are progressive, nation-leading policies that advance social justice and respond to climate change. When we implement them in a thoughtful, evidence-based and compassionate way, they are widely beneficial. I say they are progressive and nation-leading, but I shouldn't have to label them as such, because this is the work that government should be prioritising all around the nation. It's noticeable that the place we see this leadership is here in the ACT, and it's been this way for over a decade. Look at the long list of issues on which we're breaking new ground, from 100% renewable electricity to leading harm minimisation drug policies like pill testing. The ACT is leading the way in these issues because of the fact that in the ACT we have Greens in government and Greens in the balance of power. Now let me return again to the gas transition because it's a central part of this budget's response to climate change. As the Greens have said in the past, climate change can't just be a token part of ACT budgets. Every ACT budget must be a climate change budget. And this Assembly agrees. Declared in a resolution from all three parties, we are in a climate emergency. So-called natural gas is responsible for around a fifth of the ACT's greenhouse gas emissions. The gas transition is one of many changes we need to make for our future in response to the existential threat of climate change. As with all our policies, climate change or otherwise, people must remain front and centre. This is a critical element of these initiatives. We will ensure that the transition is fair, just, and that we look after our most vulnerable as the transition unfolds. Gas is expensive. Right now, living in an all-electric home can deliver residents significant financial savings. I am pleased to say that this budget supports its big transition plans with a range of supportive household energy support projects, like the $50 million Vulnerable Household Energy Support Scheme, covering both public and private housing. This is another of our key election commitments, and it's important to advance this in conjunction with the broader gas transition. The government too is committed to the transition in its own actions, reflected in the new project funding to assure its own facilities transition to renewable electricity. In a similar fashion, the ACT is transitioning away from polluting internal combustion engine vehicles to clean, zero-emission vehicles. The same transition is happening in heavy vehicles like buses and garbage trucks. Transport makes up around 60% of the ACT's greenhouse gas emissions. This transition will occur in the ACT over the next decade, supported by government targets and investment, and bolstered by incentive for purchases of these vehicles. Not only are EVs zero emissions, as they recharge using our 100% renewable electricity supply, they are also significantly cheaper to own and operate compared to a petrol vehicle. Just like the gas transition, this is a transition that we need to commence now, that will occur over time, and that has at its heart care for the environment and concern for people and the community. Now let me reiterate this point. This budget continues to invest in bold transitions that are forward-thinking, put people and the environment at their centre, and that are key policy goals and election commitments of the Greens. The Greens here in the Assembly are proud to be pushing our government partners to be leaders on these significant issues. Having said that, and as I have noted in previous years, this is not the exact budget that would be delivered if the Greens were leading the government. We work in a power-sharing, collaborative government, and that involves debate and compromise. We can't expect the budget to reflect everything that we would want. We respect and appreciate our Labor partners, but also we consistently strive to move and improve government policies and to reflect these in the ACT budget. We are making progress. Instead of the ship chugging relentlessly in the same direction, we are pulling on the steering wheel, turning its course towards sustainability, community wellbeing, long-term policy thinking, and bold climate change action. We are keeping the focus on critical challenges like climate change, the biodiversity and extinction crisis, the housing crisis, and the plight of our most vulnerable. We have heard from the Chief Minister about the key features in this budget, the lens through which he sees it, and the issues that he sees as key. This is a budget, he says, focused on housing, health, and infrastructure. It is a budget designed to gradually erode the deficit and return to surplus. The Greens agree these issues are important and we value them. We appreciate the Chief Minister's perspective and agree with it. However, I do want to add some additional thoughts from a Greens perspective on these key themes. The Greens believe that budgets must be about supporting the community, supporting people and investing in the future. But budgets are frequently discussed in terms of deficits and surpluses, with surpluses supposedly being good and deficits inherently bad. But looking through this narrow fiscal lens distorts one's priorities. The Canberra Liberals Assembly motion just this week, insisting on returning the budget to surplus, took this approach. The budget is not just numbers in a ledger, it is also the repository of government policies, of the community's needs and values, and of our collective future. Some might find this view controversial, but a budget deficit is not necessarily bad. A deficit can be a good thing when it is supporting investment in the community, the environment, the future, and indeed measures that will support economic productivity down the line. And governments can, if done prudently, reasonably afford to remain in debt. I don't make this point to encourage flagrant spending or debt, but merely to say that we shouldn't blindly focus on deficits and surpluses when critical investment in the community is at stake. It is about making smart investments. When people need help and assistance, when we need to prepare for climate change, when we need to invest in the future well-being for the community, it can be bad policy to instead grasp at a meaningless number just to try and achieve a surplus. We support the long-term investments this budget makes in issues like housing and climate change, and in community infrastructure projects like light rail for the future of our city and our citizens. If budgets are about people, Nothing is more important than ensuring our community members have a decent home. This is a critical issue for the Canberra community, who are facing an affordability and accommodation crisis. The Greens have been clear that this is a crucial focus for us. We know that it is an issue across this nation, and it is an issue affecting our community. We are committed to ensuring everyone has a decent home. Again, we are proud to see long-standing Greens policies shaping this budget. For example, the reform to establish minimum energy efficiency standards in rental properties is another chapter in Greens policy efforts that have taken over a decade of effort. Now, with these standards being finalised and becoming government policy, we expect to commence them later this year. It is a critical reform to stop people freezing in Canberra winters and boiling in summers. Houses that are too cold contribute to 6% of all deaths in Australia every year. That is a shocking figure. I was reminded of this fact and the exposure of Canberrans that are renting, as yesterday the Liberal Party aggressively questioned this reform in the Assembly. The Greens will do everything we can to eliminate homelessness. Improving housing options is a major part of the parliamentary agreement, requiring 400 additional public housing dwellings by 2025, an expansion of specialist homelessness services, and an increase in affordable housing and build-to-rent opportunities. While we know that housing affordability is a wicked problem, one that is complex and difficult to solve, and that we don't have all the levers, there is more that we can and must do to ensure that everyone has a decent home. This budget funds a range of initiatives to improve housing affordability, including to ensure that those who are struggling most can find a safe place to call home. These initiatives include the release of the build-to-rent prospectus. This exciting initiative can be used as a way to build affordable rental stock. The community housing sector has a key role to play in growing affordable housing stock. We look forward to seeing innovative proposals that will create additional rental stock and, most importantly, affordable rental stock. The budget provides a further $30 million investment to support the growing and renewing public housing program, adding a further 140 new public housing dwellings. This will ensure the ACT government delivers its commitment to grow our public housing stock by 400 properties. This will see hundreds more families with a safe and secure home. There's $57 million of investment to increase repairs and maintenance for public housing. As our public housing stock ages and as the needs of our tenants change, the need to ensure that homes are fit for purpose, contemporary and climate-wise, is more important than ever. The $2.21 million to further support our specialist homelessness services will enable more capacity to deliver emergency accommodation and crisis support. Importantly, there is also funding to better understand the needs of Canberrans facing homelessness and ensure our joint responses, as community and government, best support them on their pathway to stable accommodation. The budget also includes a range of initiatives to increase overall housing supply in Canberra and improve affordability. These are good and important measures to help Canberrans who are looking for their own home and struggling in this heightened market. And lastly, I want to note the important raising of the household energy concession to $800, a necessary increase to help people most struggling to pay their energy bills. There is also a large investment in health in the budget. As we continue into our third year of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic and mental wellbeing impacts that result, we must remember that a community is about its people. Investing in infrastructure is important so that we have buildings and equipment for our healthcare workers to deliver the best quality care for the community. But the most important part of our health system is our people. On a similar note, I mentioned that we welcome investment in the arts, particularly the 10% increase in arts spending, but are concerned that so much of this money is spent on buildings rather than people. We need to foster the careers of our artists and ensure that they are viable and paid to produce excellent work if we are to achieve our statement of ambition for the arts. The point is, buildings can be great, but don't forget about the people. Returning to health, our committed and caring health and community service workers provide care for people not only in our hospitals, but in a range of community settings. Providing that care and wellbeing and prevention and earlier intervention when a health issue emerges means we can support people closer to home and to recover sooner. It means reducing wait times for treatment and making it easier for people to access quality, affordable healthcare. The budget funds important health initiatives, which I want to emphasise. 170 additional full-time positions for healthcare this year and next. $16.4 million to expand the allied health workforce and to support more services after hours. $3 million to expand the nurse practitioner workforce, including at walk-in centres. $7 million to support the health workforce with psychosocial wellbeing, address occupational violence and embed a positive safety culture across our health services. $37.5 million to expand mental health services that we know work well, provide services in locations closer to home and introduce new services that will help fill gaps. All important investments, investing in the people that are at the heart of our community. Now, as the Greens always say, we are for people and for the planet. I have talked about the climate change emergency, the biggest threat facing our planet today. In the midst of this emergency, it can be easy to overlook its twin challenge, the extinction crisis. The recent ACT State of the Environment report has sharpened our focus on the need to solve the twin climate and nature crises together, rather than in isolation. That is why it's so critical that this budget delivers $3 million over the next 2 years to protect, connect and restore nature in the city and maximise habitat connectivity and wildlife corridors. While some of this work will shape our city's future development, it also includes the restoration of 20 sites across the city vital for habitat connectivity and climate cooling. A strong and enduring theme for the ACT Greens has been supporting the contributions of our local environment volunteers and our citizen scientists, people who know and love their patch of our bush capital like no one else. In this vein, the Connecting Nature, Connecting People initiative also enhances the Canberra Nature Map platform to better listen to and integrate citizen science contributions to identifying important species and habitat. This builds on our work last year, expanding the ACT environment grants and delivering long-term funding to our hard-working environment groups. Some people might overlook these investments or see them as insignificant in the grander scheme of the budget. They are not. They are a critical response to the environmental challenges we face. I do want to draw attention to some specific elements of this budget that people might not notice at first glance, but they are vital investments that signal the government's intent to help turn around disadvantage in a positive and collaborative way. In the justice space, our mantra is to build communities, not prisons. The ACT Greens say we must approach justice in an evidence-based and people-centric way. More reliance on prisons makes our communities less safe and creates unnecessary suffering. We want to keep people out of incarceration and help treat the problems that are seeing people enter the justice system in the first place. It's another ambitious and long-term Greens policy that strives for a reimagined society. And it is again reflected in this budget, in part through the $11.5 million to help address the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system. The programs included in this package respond to calls from the community to help address structural issues that First Nations people in the ACT face. For example, we know and understand that we need to address the social determinants of crime, and that is why we are expanding funding to the Yarrabee Bamir program to help families stay together and develop good mutual support for each other. And we understand that sentencing and bail decisions need an enhanced cultural lens, so we are increasing funding for the Gullen-Barney Circle Sentencing Court. It's a comprehensive suite of programs which makes me optimistic about the government's ambitious commitment to reach parity in incarceration rates by 2031. I also want to single out the funding that is going to develop a social recovery framework for Canberra. This is to ensure we have a plan for community recovery from COVID, as well as the 2019-20 bushfires. It will also help the community to be prepared for the increased storms, fires, droughts and other impacts of climate change in our future. This is investment that acknowledges the reality of our future. Support for resilience and recovery will need to be ongoing. This is the paradigm we exist in, as our national leaders still fail to take the action on climate change that is necessary, and where, as my federal colleagues have said, our federal Labor government is wedded to an insufficient 43% emissions reduction target. That is, to quote their razor-sharp analysis, akin to throwing a bucket of water at a house fire. Now, these investments to help the vulnerable and struggling in our society never seem enough. There is always more that we can do to help. Now, this does lead me to a particular element of this budget that the Greens do not support. I signal now that there is a spending proposal that the Greens will vote against. This is the proposal in the budget to provide almost $40 million of subsidy to the horse racing industry over the next 5 years. The $40 million is proposed despite the fact that the Independent Competition and Regulatory Commission recommended 11 years ago that the ACT industry should be self-sufficient within a decade. And yet there does seem to be a majority in this place to continue to pay the industry tens of millions of dollars, or even more if Mr Parton had his way, at a time when that money could be spent so well elsewhere. My colleague Joe Clay has brought this issue to the public's attention and has received a great deal of public support. The budget is supposed to reflect what we value as a community and the future we want to build together. I am confident the community would prefer this $40 million to go to public housing and homelessness, or mental health support, or climate change adaptation, or public transport, or 100 other things. We should be using this money to invest in issues that will help Canberrans now and into the future. In conclusion, I reiterate that the Greens support this budget, even if there are some elements we would do differently, and even though we will explicitly vote against one element, we support its important investments. We need budgets that courageously make long-term investments that care for people, address inequalities and injustices, and respond to climate change. Policies like the transition to a society that uses clean and affordable renewable energy, the transition to clean electric vehicles, record investment in addressing homelessness and growing housing, expanded mental health services, a determined and thoughtful approach to justice that builds communities and reduces incarceration, and investment in our local environment. This budget does all those things, and the Greens are proud of our role in steering it to these outcomes. In government and on the crossbench, we will keep striving to build a caring, compassionate, sustainable future for Canberrans.